Israel's fragile coalition falls. The government agrees to dissolve parliament and prepare for another round at the polls. But will a new vote end the political deadlock? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Israel. If a democracy's health were based on the number of elections it held, Israel would be the healthiest democracy in the world. After the Bennet-Lapid government filed a motion to dissolve parliament on Monday, the country is now heading to its fifth election in 3 years.
My friend, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid and I decided to work together to dissolve the Knesset and to set to hold elections at an agreed time. At the same time, transferring the power in an orderly manner and ensuring the national interest of the State of Israel. Even during the transition period, the state continues.
When the historically diverse Bennet-Lapid-led coalition took power a year ago, it gave some Israelis hope, while others called it a joke. Because no single party in Israel's history has ever won an outright majority, coalitions are the norm, and for a time, they worked well enough. But the Bennet-Lapid government is deeply different. It consists of 8 parties from across the political spectrum, including those who are ideologically opposed. So while some argue diversity is good for democracy, on a practical level, it can make things very hard to get done. That's left more and more Israelis frustrated with perpetual government deadlock.
I'm not happy. I think the country needs stability. And having elections every several months or even every year is not good.
I think that the election is just a waste of time and a waste of money, and I don't think that something will change now in the political field. And I don't think that the change of the prime minister, meaning that Lapid will be the prime minister, will change anything.
I think this is bad for Israel, for all the people, because Bibi was the only one and the best. I think for all the people, we wait for this. Wait for a long time.
So could another election backfire for Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid? Their alliance may have been divided, but they passionately agreed that Benjamin Netanyahu needed to go. When they formed the coalition, that was enough to oust the former prime minister. Now the question is if another vote could actually usher in Bibi's return. Despite serious accusations of corruption, Netanyahu still has significant support, and he's delighted to see the Bennet-Lapid coalition crumble.
I must tell you that this evening people are smiling. Even on the way over here, people are simply smiling. Because they feel that despite this consciousness modification, which we also heard tonight, they understand that something great happened here. We are getting rid of the worst government in Israel's history.
So what will yet another election bring to Israel? And what really led this diverse coalition to fall apart? To debate that and more, I'm joined now from West Jerusalem by Jeremy Saltan, a special advisor to Naftali Bennett's Yamina faction. Also from West Jerusalem is Mitchell Barak. He served as an aide to Benjamin Netanyahu and was a speechwriter for former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. And Evan Cohen is a lecturer at Tel Aviv University and former spokesperson for Benjamin Netanyahu. Thanks all so much for being with us. Mitchell Barak, when we spoke a year ago, you said it was in no one's best interest to go to elections again and that the Bennet-Lapid government could effectively work. Yet here we are. So what went wrong?
Well, it worked for a year, and it worked for one of the main purposes of what those parties set out to do, which was to replace Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. So it was successful in that regard. It was successful in the regard that it put together the most diverse group of Israelis ever assembled in a government. Israelis from all political spectrums, Israelis who are religious and who are secular, Israelis from the right and the left, Israelis who are Arab Israelis, who are Arab citizens of Israel. So it was a very, very wide-ranging government. They had very, very clear goals, which they basically kept to. They passed the budget. They were improving certain economic indicators. and it was going well, dealing with also some foreign policy issues with the Iranian issue. I think where it failed was more internally with Prime Minister Bennett, meaning he did a fantastic job of leveraging his 7 seats by basically kind of offering a blackmail offer in the beginning by saying, either my 7 seats go with Netanyahu, which is what I would prefer, or I'm going to lead with those 7 seats and be prime minister in a rotation. So he actually did the rotation, and those 7 seats went down to 6 when the government took office, and now they're down to 4. So had it not been for the prime minister's own political shortcomings in selecting people, maybe, or his inability to lead his own people that he appointed in his party, the government would still be going forward.
But it's interesting that you say it's successful based on the fact that they managed to oust Netanyahu. So would you consider it successful if Netanyahu makes a return by October?
Well, it is very, very possible that Netanyahu will make a return. But, you know, at the meantime, when this 4th election happened, a lot of the public had been tired of Netanyahu or wanted to replace him. Some of those people may come back to Netanyahu, so I think he has an increased chance. At the same time, some people see that the state of Israel keeps functioning even without Netanyahu, which is something that Netanyahu convinced everyone was not going to happen, that the country was going to fall apart, and it hasn't fallen apart. The only other thing I would like to add is Prime Minister Bennett, I think, did a brilliant political move by basically stepping down and honoring his agreement with Yair Lapid and not rolling the dice and waiting to see maybe he could be the prime minister in the interim during the election. Instead of that, he did a very, very mature thing by honoring the agreement, something that Netanyahu did not do when he had a partnership with Benny Gantz, and Benny Gantz didn't do when he was with Lapid. So I think we see he raises the bar for morality, if you will, for decency, for integrity of Israeli politicians between him and Yair Lapid. So it's going to be a formidable team competing again. But again, it's Netanyahu versus everyone else.
Okay. Let me turn to Evan Cohen. I could see a slight smirk on your face. So, I mean, is that a fair assessment, do you think, of what was done right and what wasn't?
Look, well, one would wonder if the government were so successful, as we just heard, why it fell apart. Okay? It's not because of Bennett's party that the government fell apart. The reason that the government fell apart was that it was not successful. It basically did not function. They passed a budget, but despite what people think, a budget is probably one of the easiest things to pass because all you have to do is buy people off, and they bought people off very, very efficiently. So the budget did pass. But then what happened, ever since the budget passed, they have been having great difficulty doing anything else. All of the ideological platforms of all of the components of the government, and we're not talking about Bennett's party and the left-wing party, every single component of the government was not able to forward their ideological platforms. And what we noticed in the polls, almost immediately after the formation of the government, there was initial euphoria, great, we have a government, we'll have a budget. But then the government started losing ground. And for many, many months, popular support in Israel for the government has basically been suboptimal, to put it mildly. And even now, when one looks at the popular support, one can see that former Prime Minister Netanyahu gets more support from the public than all the other opponents combined. So if you put together Bennett and Lapid and Saar and Gantz and everyone else combined, they get less support than Netanyahu. Unfortunately, that's not the way we elect our prime ministers here in Israel. What we have to do is vote for certain parties. And because Prime Minister Netanyahu's party does not have 51% of the Knesset, we need to form coalitions. But Prime Minister Netanyahu as a person has more support in the Israeli public than all his competitors combined. Now, this government fell apart because it lost popular support. The moment it lost popular support, people in the government began to realize that they would not be re-elected if they continued along these lines. And so one by one, they started withdrawing, mainly from Yamina, but not only from Bennett's party. Other parties, too, have seen their members of Knesset withdrawing from the effective support of the government.
Okay. I can see you shaking your head, Mitchell, but I do want to get Jeremy into the fold here. Go ahead, Jeremy. I want to get Yamina's perspective on what you've just heard.
Look, this was a historic government. This was a government that actually worked for the people. As Mitchell said before, this was the most diverse government. You had Jews, Arabs, religious, secular, immigrants, native Israelis. You had people from the right, the center, and the left. This was a historic government that broke all of the taboos and was able to unite the nation. And yes, we were able to pass a state budget, the first time the Knesset passed one since the last vote in 2018. The normal thing, which we did not have because, unfortunately, we were dragged into 4 elections and now a 5th election over what should have been just one single term because of one man who has decided to keep the entire Israeli political process hostage and not move on. And because of that, we are stuck in the deadlock that we are in today. Despite what was said, you know, it's sort of the previous argument I heard from Evan sort of reminded me of the people crying of the popular vote versus the electoral college. We have a system in Israel, as in the great majority of parliamentary systems, where you must get a majority of parliament. And yes, after 4 elections and even going into a 5th election, it looks very clear that Netanyahu, the opposition leader, does not have any ability to get a majority of parliament. So if I have to go ahead and sum up this year, I look at the economic feats of being able to lower the deficit down to practically 0, lowering unemployment to record levels, being able to have economic growth indicators very high, higher than we saw throughout the 12 years of Netanyahu's previous term.
Okay.
You top that up with security and diplomatic achievements. This was a very successful year.
Okay, let me come back to Mitchell because, yes, we have heard the achievements listed. But still, I'd asked initially what really went wrong. And one theory out there is that it was actually the settler bill that ruined the government's chances of survival. And I'd like you to speak to that if you can. It's, of course, the law that grants that special status to Israeli settlers in the West Bank.
Yeah,
go ahead, Mitchell.
There's an emergency law that's been going on for 55 years, since 1967, which basically says people that live in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, Israeli law is extended to them, and not Jordanian law, because the West Bank belonged to Jordan before that, before Israel was attacked from there. So Israeli law is extended for driver's licenses, for the police, and so forth, for the Israeli citizens that are living there. Every 5 years, the law is up for renewal. It's like a rubber stamp. Everyone votes for it. It passes pretty easily, except those who don't want to vote for it, who, you know, are not in the Knesset or want to make an ideological stand. Ironically, and this is such an irony, is that the parties that opposed it were the Prime Minister's party, the one who wanted to, you know, annex the West Bank, the one who talks about increasing settlements, even though he was one of the financial architect of the withdrawal from Gaza. He certainly is the, father of many, many settlements and settlers. And for him and the Likud and the right-wing parties to turn their back on it, just in order to bring down the government and to get them to lose this important vote in the Knesset, that's what was caused. They actually turned their back on the settlers. And then what happened is, because at the end of the month, if July 1st comes, there'll be total legal chaos in the West Bank for Israelis. Naftali Bennett met with the legal advisor of the Prime Minister's office, who says there is really no way to change it if the law is not extended by the Knesset, unless Israel is in an election. So that was one of the main things that he made him decide to call elections. So ironically, Naftali Bennett, who everyone is saying is a leftist, went with an Arab party and a leftist party, all of whom basically, except for a few of those members of the coalition, voted to extend it, even though many were ideologically opposed to it. In Meretz and Ra'am, Mansour Abbas's party, this is what he's doing to actually save the settlers at this point. So it's a very, very ironic and cynical move by Netanyahu, and that's what's really bringing about elections at this point. That's the issue, which will make it even more interesting.
I mean, Evan, just simply put, I mean, if it hadn't been for the settler bill, do you think this government could have somehow survived?
Absolutely not. There's no question whatsoever. The settler bill is just an excuse. Okay. The settler bill, the whole issue of the settler bill was raised long after the government had started disintegrating, basically. What happened, I mean, I won't get into the finer details here because I'm sure that your viewers, A, won't be interested in, and B, it would take a lot more background knowledge in order to understand them. But what happened was that one member of Naftali Bennett's party left immediately upon the formation of the government. And another member left when she determined that Israel was no longer behaving as a Jewish state should behave. This was long before the settler bill. On the other hand, 3 members of parliament from the left-wing parties also declined to vote with the coalition for their own various reasons. So the settler bill has absolutely nothing to do with the disintegration of the government other than being a formality. What should be noted, by the way, interesting you noted that Mitchell just spoke, he referred to the prime minister, which is not just a slip of the tongue. Nobody really views Bennett as a legitimate prime minister. Netanyahu is viewed by many, including Mitchell, who referred to Netanyahu as the prime minister, very interestingly. So anyway, getting back to the issue over here, the government is falling apart not because of the settler bill, but because they can't function as a government. They haven't been able to pass any significant legislation for months now.
Okay, I want to move on, though, and I'm going to stay with you quickly because we now have Netanyahu saying that the path is basically clear for him to take the next election and form this broad nationalist government headed by Likud. I have to ask you if Israeli voters, you think, will buy into that, if they will be willing to look past the last election and the corruption allegations that have so plagued him and lost him the last vote. Is Israel ready to see him return?
I think that you raise the issue of the corruption allegations, and I think that what we've seen over the last year, and this is extremely important, is that the case against Netanyahu in court has been falling apart. Every single witness, one after the other, has basically been destroyed with evidence by the cross-examiners. And this, most people who are following the trial very closely, like I am, know this already. The Israeli public knows that these trumped-up charges against Netanyahu will not hold any water in the long run. So what I think will happen in the upcoming elections is that Netanyahu will have a victory. And I'm not talking about 60 or 61. It'll be broader than that, because what people aren't saying is that not only does the Likud and the Likud by the way, the Likud's partners, the ultra-Orthodox parties, they always underperform in the polls. They'll be getting more than they're predicted to get in the polls. But more importantly, several of the opposition parties, the current opposition parties, are simply on the borderline of the threshold, meaning if one of them doesn't pass, immediately the Likud will become a much bigger party. Furthermore, what we can also see happening is that the longer this government continues to function, the more support the opposition parties are garnering. So I can't see in any way how any other government after the election will be formed besides a Netanyahu-led government, which I think the right-wing parties, which are currently in the coalition, will probably join as well. I don't think that they'll want to remain in the opposition.
Jeremy, I can see you disagree, and I want to turn to you. And I need to also, I do want you to respond to that, obviously, and I need to include what was kind of my own observation and how I find it kind of hard to reconcile how sanguine Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett actually seemed making the announcement to dissolve Parliament, knowing that it could very likely usher in, but not likely, my apologies, possibly usher in Benjamin Netanyahu just a little more than a year after they worked so hard to take him out.
You know, it's a refreshing thing to see a prime minister actually live up to his word and actually act based on what it was that he promised that he was going to do, which was to go through with the rotation. Of course, the last government fell because Benjamin Netanyahu lied to Benny Gantz and did not go through with the rotation. Look, we're in a situation where I just disagree with everything that Evan said. That is just complete propaganda. Number one, this government is falling completely for one reason, and that is the Judean Samaria law. And the second thing is, if Netanyahu is not able to get a majority in 4 elections, there is no reason in common science to expect that he will suddenly, magically be able to get a 5th, in the 5th election, see a different result. The majority of Israelis do not want to see Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. That was determined with the last 4 elections. That will be determined with the 5th election as well. I have complete confidence in terms of that result. Now, what is important to see here is that what Prime Minister Naftali Bennett did was save the state of Israel twice. The first time by making a tremendous, courageous decision to enter this very complicated, diversified coalition, which had never been tried before. And the second time by going ahead and saving Judea and Samaria and the Israeli law there, when the opposition, in a very, very terrible attempt, decided to take the 500,000 Israelis living there hostage and say, the only way that I will release them is if you pay the ransom of dispersing the Knesset early. That is exactly the way that things unfolded. And it's very unfortunate because a lot of those 500,000 citizens are actually the constituents. 2/3 of the people living in the settlements voted for the opposition parties. And what they did in this event was completely let them down.
Okay, Mitchell, just going back to the first part of what Jeremy was saying, and what you expect to see in in another election. Is it just going to be a repeat of the last election? You know, charged to the Israeli taxpayer with the same people and the same.
I mean,
go ahead.
I think we're pretty much going to have the same thing. Meaning, I will take issue to what Evan said. I don't think there's a lot of right-wing parties that are ready to go with Netanyahu. Netanyahu is either you like him or you hate him, and there are a lot of people. Most of his enemies, in fact, almost all of his enemies in politics today are people that worked for him or worked with him. There's nobody new on the scene that came out and says, I don't like Netanyahu. It's his former chief of staff. It's his former, director general, Lieberman. It's Lapid was his finance minister. Everyone who worked with him refuses to work with him again and doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And that should tell you something also about how he works and what people think about him, if that's what they're saying. Now, if you want, yes, Likud is probably going to get more seats in the last election. I can tell you this one thing. Likud could put together a government, not of 60 seats, of 70 or 75 seats, very wide-ranging nationalist government. The only thing they would have to do is remove Netanyahu. If Netanyahu said he was retiring from politics tomorrow or going to do something else, the Likud could elect almost any leader in the Likud and could put together a government, including some of the parties that are in the coalition today. So the issue here is Netanyahu. Either they're for him or against him. And as long as he's there in the Likud, he's going to get the most seats. And many, many Israelis want to see him as prime minister, although that's not how you vote, because most people are not voting for the prime minister when they vote for the Knesset. They're voting for who's going to represent them in the Knesset. But as long as he's there, the deadlock of 60-60 is going to stay. And what brought down this government right now is 100% the Judea and Samaria bill to extend Israeli law, nothing else. And it's because there are certain also Israeli Arab members of Knesset that weren't comfortable voting for it. Just like they're not comfortable, they wanted the nation-state law change. That's really the big problem in this coalition, is how do the Israeli Arabs vote for certain things they don't want and certain things that ideologically they have a problem with. But all of those things were possible to bridge the gap, and they saw the long-term good. And having done polling in the Arab sector, I can tell you 70% of Israeli Arabs either want to join the government, 30%, or 40% supported from the outside and be included. So there's a real movement to get involved in Israeli politics and Israeli society. So this is a step in the right direction. We'll see what the results are from this next election. Okay,
Evan, I'll let you respond, to the assessment of the other two panelists here that, Netanyahu is not an asset. He's a liability.
Well, something that both Jeremy and Mitchell have repeatedly said again and again, that there's no reason to expect a different result in these elections compared to the previous 4 elections. There's a huge reason to expect a different result, because when Netanyahu started his electoral campaign for the first of the last 4 elections, people had a 10-year experience of Netanyahu as prime minister, and most voters couldn't even remember what it was like to have another government in power, a left-wing government in power. They now know. They have seen what a left-wing government in power can do, how much damage can be caused to our relationships, for example, with Eastern Europe, and not necessarily with Russia. Okay, with Russia, no one's on good terms with Russia today, but I'm saying our relationship with Eastern European countries, and even things like the Abraham Accords, which were running forward. There were 2 more countries which were on the verge of signing. Nothing. Everything has been frozen. So people have no.
Morocco signed, Evan. Morocco signed.
Morocco was on board before the new government was formed. That's nothing to do with it. So Morocco was already
Barak
on board.
signed
with
under
government
Bennett.
reform,
Bennett was the
as
first prime minister to visit there. Bennett was the first prime minister to
Absolutely.
visit there. I mean, the Abraham, nobody needs Netanyahu to use the Abraham Accords. Let's not exaggerate. Let's
Netanyahu
not
didn't visit the Gulf
exaggerate.
states either. Are you denying the fact that Netanyahu signed the Abraham Accords with 4 Gulf states without visiting
Amazing.
them?
Amazing.
Exactly.
But it doesn't end with Netanyahu. It doesn't end with
Absolutely.
Netanyahu. And the
Okay.
damage, and the
Absolutely
damage
does
with
not
the
end-
relationship
there's
with the
no
Democratic
question.
Party is also
There's no
his.
question.
Gentlemen, I have to
There's no question that
apologize.
it is Netanyahu.
Yeah,
There's no-
just as things were, just as things were getting heated, we very unfortunate, and we've lost Jeremy. Okay, I am going to have to leave it there. The clock is very much against us, and we're completely out of time now. For this edition of the Newsmakers, I'd really like to thank all 3 of my panelists so much for being with us. I'm sure we'll be talking about this in the very near future again. So thanks all, and our viewers, of course. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.